Anybody else? Yes. Jerry. Only people who owe me money call me Mr. Doyle. That we're what? Hated for our freedoms by who? If you're talking about hated for our freedoms with regard to terrorism, justifying going to war, well, the reason we had an overreaction to 9/11. We played into Al-Qaeda and the Taliban's hands, Al-Shabaab, Al-Aqsa's Martyr Brigade. This is really a multi-century struggle for who's going to control Islam. And as long as we continue to depose heads of countries, whether it's Egypt or Syria, Lebanon, then they're going to be able to install one of their religious governments, and we're helping them to do it. I find it odd that Muammar Gaddafi was a good guy for 42 years until he was a bad guy. So it took us 42 years to figure out that Muammar Gaddafi was a bad guy, but we knew in the first couple of days that the rebels were the good guys. But we don't even know who the rebels are. But now we're coming to find out who they are, and they're not the good guys either. If you follow the money, you'll come to find out why what's happening is happening. If you look at Libya, there's 200 miles of pristine Mediterranean coast. I guarantee you there's going to be hotels and golf courses. And there's somebody in there early that knows we're going and knows we're staying. Now, why didn't the Republicans cancel the funding? They have the constitutional authority and responsibility to do that. They voted that they're against Obama's intervention in Libya. We'll cut off the funding. Same thing with the Democrats. You give us the power, we're going to cut off the funding, we're going to bring the troops home. 3 years later, 3.5 years later, still hasn't happened. When you take a look at where the money is, where the money goes, you'll come to understand a lot of why what's happening is happening and why what should happen doesn't. On Wall Street, I worked with Drexel Burnham and Prusek and unindicted for 10 years. And I saw how the bodies were buried and how they worked to keep the bodies buried. And that's exactly what's happening right now. You take a look at credit default swaps. You don't even have to know what they are. Credit default swaps are basically derivatives, synthetic derivatives. It's a bet on something working or something not. Now, when we had the financial collapse, they said nobody knew this was going to happen until 24 hours before Bear Stearns went, I was going to use a term, I won't, kerflooey, we'll use that term. But they knew back in 2003, they knew back in 2004, 5, and 6. They knew at the World Economic Forum because they had breakout sessions sponsored by Goldman Sachs talking about the inevitability of the financial bubble bursting, and it was probably going to show up in housing, student loans, or consumer debt. So they knew. But how did they miss credit default swaps going from $100 billion to $62 trillion in 10 years? How'd they miss that? They wanted to. They wanted to miss it. How did we end up with $600 trillion in total derivative exposure? Because they knew it was happening, but they wanted it to happen. Now here's the irony. How did they bust Elliot Spitzer? Elliot Spitzer was hiring whores, right? $5,000. Banks generate things called suspicious activity reports, SARs. And they're numbered. They're not named. They're just numbers that go through the system, and they look at the patterns. They look for redundancy. They look for location. They look for size. And all these spit out these reports. Suspicious activity report says this number, 122799433. A $5,000 transaction. One $5,000 transaction happened to be Elliot Spitzer, who hired a hooker with the $5,000. I'm not condoning hiring hookers or cheating on your wife. Don't do it. But is it just odd that they missed $100 trillion in credit default swaps, but they found $5,000 for Elliot Spitzer, who was the Attorney General in New York, who was investigating Wall Street, who was against Dick Grasso's $178 million pay package? Any coincidence there, or is it just that stuff just happens? $600 trillion in derivatives. The entire residential real estate market in the United States is $11 trillion. How do we end up with $600 trillion? A synthetic derivative was created to bet against the housing market. As they were telling clients, go long, mortgage-backed securities, they created a synthetic derivative that you could short, the ABX, on the exchange, betting against the housing market. So while the left side was saying good, right side was saying short it. People were making billions and billions and billions of dollars. Why hasn't housing recovered? Because of leverage. Henry Paulson, the former Treasury Secretary, when he was at Goldman Sachs, petitioned the SEC in 2004 to get rid of the leverage ratios, which were restricted at 14 to 1. They acquiesced. Leverage ratios went from somewhere between 30 and 60 to 1. That's how you end up with $600 trillion in derivatives. They wanted this to happen. And what's happening now? Deleveraging. That's why nothing's happening. That's why we haven't hit a bottom. That's why housing hasn't recovered. That's why we don't have jobs. There's only two things that causes a company to hire an employee: service or product. Demand drives both. If we ain't buying, they ain't making. You can have all the stupid tax credits you want. I'm not going to hire somebody because you gave me a $4,000 tax credit. I'm going to hire somebody because there's a demand for my product. Consumers right now are leveraged 112% debt to income. It was as high as 124. Best number is about 85. My best number says that if we increase income by 3.5 trillion and or decrease debt by 3.4 trillion, and we use a normal hiring pattern of somewhere between 200 to 400,000 jobs per month, a real recovery without devaluation or without inflation is going to take 5 to 7 years. That's the real number. That's probably how long we're in for it. But government says we're going to create jobs. No, you're not. Now, the previous speaker talked about Solyndra. Republicans want to make it, oh, Obama's corrupt. Yeah, what about the $1 trillion prescription drug benefit bill that the Republicans gave without being paid for, that was pushed through by Billy Tozan, the Republican from Louisiana, who's now the president of the Pharmaceutical Manufacturing Association of America? They're both corrupt. But the problem isn't Solyndra. Two other companies went bankrupt at the same time. The problem is China's dumped solar panels to the tune of 2,592% more since 2006. China's holding $1.2 trillion of our reserves. You think we can get free and fair trade with commie China? Nope. We're over there saying green stamps, steak knives, please. We're like the video professor of debt. Try my product. Why? We should be telling communist China, keep your shitty products, keep your lousy fish, keep your tainted drywall, We had a Christmas toy 3 years ago from commie China that had the date rape drug in it. It was a toy called Aquadots. And we're still doing business with commie China? Why? Because they own us. They tell us what to do. We should have $1.2 trillion of their reserves. We should have their 9.4% GDP growth instead of 1.5. We should be the nation of last resort, the lender of last resort. We should be number one, not number 5. We should be schooling the rest of the world, but we're not. Because both the Republicans and the Democrats have carved up the country for their own special interest. And until we deal with commie China, the Solyndras are symptomatic of a much bigger problem: American competitiveness. I tell the rest of the world, I can't tell you here. Let's go fuck yourselves. Really. And it's not that I'm isolationist or protectionist, but you got to start here first. You got to start here. If we don't focus on us, if I don't take care of myself, how do I take care of my 83-year-old mom? But we become so dependent. Social Security, really? You want to work your whole god darn life and then have the government tell you you can retire at 68 and you're going to get $1,423? Really? Go pound salt. I'll decide when I retire how much I retire with. And Social Security should be tip money. It shouldn't be the dictator of what your lifestyle is going to be. But as long as we have people dependent on Social Security, then the government's got power. And as long as the government's got power, they're going to go for more power. And until we opt out and say, yeah, whatever, go pound salt, I'm good, I'm taking care of me. That's the mindset that I think is the revolution that's taking place in America. I got me, I got you, we got each other, cool. Now let's go get them. Last one? We're done. We got to wrap it up. Thanks very much. Ron and Rand Paul supposedly at the cocktail party will be broadcasting tomorrow noon to 3. Please feel free to stop by and mock me. Thanks for having me. I appreciate it. Thank you.